Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to redo a quick exercise we did in class involving using part of some footage to show up elsewhere in the footage, using some simple masking and some basic effects, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about rotoscoping. That'll be towards the end of this. So if you want to jump to that, you can jump ahead to the end of the video. Um, Here I'm going to work with some red footage. And I'm going to open up my red folder, which you'll see has these multiple files inside it. Again, remember the way that red records. These are all part of the same shot. It's just been broken up into different files. So I'm just going to grab the first one of these. I'll put it into a new composition by dragging it over the new composition icon. And now I have a new composition with this footage. So remember this from class. I'm going to go into that composition, right click on it, rename, and call this people on road. And I'm also going to go into the composition settings. I could have done the rename in here as well. And I'm just going to change the time code on this to start at 0. Again, that's not something you have to do, but just something I want to do to make it a little easier to keep track of where I am in here. You also see the resolution when I drag this red footage onto the new composition. By default, it's set the composition settings to the same frame rate and pixel dimensions as the footage itself. So this was shot red 4K or really UHD 3840 by 2160. So it set it to that, so at full resolution. Okay, and what I have here in this shot is these characters who walking down the road, and this cop car comes and arrests them and then drives off. And as mentioned in class, what I want to do is get rid of the whole cop car part and just have them sort of walk off, and they're going to fade out and reappear sort of here in the distance like they're walking off into the distance. Um, and as we saw in class for the actual shot in the movie where this was done, they kind of appear a bunch of places down the road to sort of show them walking off into the distance. For this quick tutorial, I'm just going to put them way down here at the end of the road and show how you do that. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is get a clean section of road. So I'm going to find a little period here where I've got some clear road there before they're on it and before the cop car is on it. I'm going to go to my layer and duplicate it. So I still have the original footage down here, and then I have this new copy. And I'm going to make this copy end right here. So I'm going to do Option right bracket. And you'll see that made the end of this shot here. And I'll go to the beginning of it before they're on the road, do Option right bracket. Now you can see I have a little chunk here of footage with nobody on the road. Actually looks like there's a little shake in the camera there, so let's wait till that shake is over. Okay, so I'll shorten that down even more. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is just make a mask here of the road so that I can have an empty part of road when I want it. So I'll go to my mask tool, G, to get the pen, and I'm just going to sort of rough out that chunk of road there. Okay, so now I have an empty road that's empty for the whole length of this. Okay. And now that I have that, I could duplicate this layer. So I'm going to highlight the layer, Command D as in dog to duplicate. And I can shift this down a little further. So now I have a longer section of time with that empty piece of road before it's gone. And I can do the same thing, make several copies here, and just sort of shift them along here. Obviously, before I do this, I would want to make sure that my mask is correct, that the section of footage is good, that there's no camera movement or anything else like that. Since we're just roughing this in, if it turns out it's not perfect, that's okay, but if I was really going to use this composition, I'd want to make sure that if I'm going to duplicate a chunk, that I have the whole thing working really well. you might ask, why don't we just freeze frame it and just extend that freeze frame? And that's certainly a possibility. The challenge is that a lot of times you'll see a little bit of movement, maybe it was some grass or a speck of dust on here, or just even the pixels changing a little bit of digital noise. And that gives that sense of motion. And our eye is very perceptive to when there's just a freeze frame laid over something. So I'm going to try to avoid using a freeze frame where I can. I'd rather have some footage that I'm looping. Okay, I'll make a few more of those, and we'll say that's enough. We kind of got this section covered that we want. And just so I can keep track of that, I'm going to make my composition end where that goes. So I've just gotten, so I just have a composition the length of all that extra footage. So I'll use the N as in Nancy key to make that the end of the work area. And you'll notice my little work area bar here is going to shrink down at the end. So now I'm just covering this sort of 30-second period here. Okay, and you'll notice that I didn't start right at the beginning, but that's okay because at the very beginning of the shot, if I go back to my original layer, I sort of got the empty road, the camera does a little bit of movement and then stabilizes, and then the characters come out. And you can see when they, now that I've turned back on that underlying layer, you can see when they come out under the mask there. Okay, I still got those masks on top. Okay, now I have a whole bunch of layers here to make this a little easier for myself, just to keep track of things. I'm going to highlight all of those layers that are just that empty road, and I'm going to make a pre-comp, which is a pre-composition. It's basically consolidating all that stuff into something that will just look like one layer on my composition, but it's actually a whole separate composition that I'm laying in as its own layer. So got all those selected. I'll right-click. I have this option that says pre-compose. So I'll pre-compose that. Call this empty road. And now I've got this new composition just called empty road. Right? And if I were to open this composition here, you can see I've still got all this stuff inside it that I did. But the beauty of this is this now lets me work with just this as one layer. It appears as one layer in my main composition. So this is a good way to kind of keep yourself organized if you're working on a really complicated composition to keep things manageable by working in pre-comps and then bringing those layers in. Or I can work in here, and when I get a bunch of things, as I did in this case, that all sort of go together and make one sort of concept, like this empty road, I can use the pre-comp option to bring those all together. Okay, so I've got my empty road there, and under it I have this original footage. I'm going to turn off the empty road for a second here. Make another copy of my original footage. So I highlighted this layer, Command D to duplicate it. And you'll see I just turned off my eye icon for the moment because I don't want to see that empty road. And I'm actually just going to turn off all this audio just because I don't want any of the audio from this shot anyway. Okay, so now what I'm going to look for a little piece where they're sort of walking along the road here, okay? And I like them walking along the center line there. Let's see. Kind of stumble around. Okay, there's a good little piece here. Let's say there at the end, so I'm going to shorten this layer. Option right bracket to make that the end. And they're sort of stumbling along like that. We'll say I like that. Option left bracket to make that the start. So now I have this layer that just has the time where they're wandering around. And I'm going to mask this as well. Can sort of rough something in here. I'm going to look a little bit later how we could get them masked much more precisely using a rotoscope if we wanted to. But for the moment, I'm going to go ahead and just sort of grab that area. And I can go in here, hit the drop down box on my mask, and I'll just feather the edges of that a little bit. H key to move this around. Go back to my regular selector key V. Okay, So I got just a little bit of feathering around the edges there so I don't get such a hard border. Okay, and I've got a copy of them walking down the road here for a while that looks good. Um, Now, if I turn my empty road back on, in this case, it's not going to cover that up because my empty road, you remember, only went to 30 seconds. So let's move this back here. Okay, and so it's still there, but they're covered up by this empty road mask right now. And I can just move this in front of the empty road. Show them walking. And again, I'd have to set up my timing for the rest of this shot and everything else to work. And I might also have to keyframe my mask a little bit. If I look in here, probably starting to just get cut off around her hair there. So we want to add one more point here, just stretch that out a little bit to make sure that I'm not losing the top of them as they move. Okay. Now, the interesting part of this, and I could go back and work with this beginning so I don't get two copies of them coming through, but the interesting part I want to do is what happens when we want them to be over here later on. So I'm going to take this layer I made of them walking down the road, and I'll make a copy of it. I'm going to move it a little later on here. And still in front of the empty road because I don't want to see whatever's going on behind them. And I'm going to take this, open up that layer, I'm going to transform it and move them down here to the end of the road. I'm going to shrink them down. So that they look sort of the appropriate scale for where they are. And that's probably close. You might want that maybe a little bit smaller. Okay, so let's say something like that. And obviously a lot of this is not a science, but an art and kind of figuring out exactly how big I want them to look. Now the problem is that still sticks out like a sore thumb. Even with my edges feathered, it's still really obvious that this kind of surface here is different than what they're on because two things. One is by the time I'm that far away, you can see this isn't that my picture is out of focus. It's that we're looking through a lot of atmosphere. Things are getting a little blurry with all that sort of morning fog in this case as they're getting into the distance. And they're also getting kind of washed out, lower contrast. If you look at the closer part of the shot, you can see a little more contrast. This is sort of a darker green. This is clear. And as I get sort of into the distance, everything's brightening up and getting lower in contrast just because of that distance and all that air that I'm looking through this time in the morning. So I want to do some effects to this layer to make it sort of fit better. And a couple of simple things. One is I could do a little bit of a blur. So I'll just type blur over in my effects preset, effects and presets window. If you don't see that, you can go under window, effects and presets. And I'll double click on this to throw that effect on. And so you could try out different blurs, see what they do. I tend to like the camera lens blur for things like this. And I can increase the strength of that a little bit to get it to where it looks like it's kind of about the same level of blurriness as this stuff. Let's say I like that for the moment. Now that looks a little better. If I click on this effects thing, I can turn it on and off. So you can see that looks like they're way too sharp. Now it kind of looks like they're at least kind of at that same distance blurriness wise, but the color is still really different. Um, so there's a couple of different color correction effects I could try here. I'm going to type in the search bar, and let's try just a brightness one. So there's a brightness and contrast filter. I'll double click on that. It brings it up over here. And it's pretty simple. I have two controls, brightness and contrast. So I could up the brightness. You see I can get something that looks a little better there. Maybe try lowering the contrast, brightening it up some more. That's not terrible. I would probably do some more with color correction. I might go into actually the levels tool and just kind of bring things up closer to white and change my gamma, which I do, and that's the tool I use in the billboard replacing video. That's not too bad. If you want to see what that other one would look like, let's just try if instead of this I did a levels tool or a levels effect. Let's see what I can do with that. If I sort of pull up my blacks and adjust the gamma a little bit, that's probably a little closer to what I'm looking for, because it's giving them that same sort of like hazy feel. And actually, now that I see that, I think, I probably need a little bit more blur on them once I've matched the color space, and something like that. Okay, so not perfect, but now when I'm looking off in the distance at them, that looks a lot closer than what I started with to actually matching the shot. If I really want to tweak this up, I still got this yellow line here that I need to do something about. But that's the general idea. So that would be kind of how I would use this original footage and change literally what happened in the shot. So instead of a cop car coming and picking them up, they've gone further down here. While I have this footage up, I want to show an example of one other thing, which would be doing some simple rotoscoping. So I'm just going to jump up here to a later part of the shot, go back to my original footage, duplicate it, Command D again, and just for clarity, I'm going to rename this layer, right-clicked on it, and say Rotoscope, and make this layer start here. So to rotoscope a layer, what this means is I'm making a mask around something, but I'm doing it very, very precisely. And you can do this yourself, like draw a very precise mask around things, but After Effects actually has some tools built in to kind of help you do this and do it partially automatically. So I'll say it's automatic with a lot of supervision. To do this, I have to open up this layer, so I can't do it in the composition itself. I have to find the layer I want and double click on that to open it up. And I know this was something that has messed up some people before. Remember, I have multiple windows here that can be open at the same time. So here is my composition called People on the Road. Here's my layer called Rotoscope. And so I want to always make sure I'm working in the right window. So let's blow this up a little bit and look at it. And so let's say I wanted to get a really precise kind of mask around them. Give myself a little more room there. So my rotoscoping tool is up here. Option W is the shortcut. You want to be careful because there's two different shortcuts in here that both use, or two different tools that both use Option W, so you want to make sure you know which one you're in. And the first is my Roto brush tool. So this is always where I'm going to start. It's the one that looks like a brush, not the one that has these sort of hair-like things on here. It's just a brush on a person. And I get a little target, and the target is green by default. If I hold down Option, it turns red. I'll talk about what those two do. The other thing I can do is if I hold down the Command key and move left and right, I can change kind of how big that brush is. So depending on what you're rotoing, you might need a bigger or smaller brush, so I can adjust that way. I'm going to get one that's reasonably small there. So what I want to do is I'm going to use this to paint over the things that I want to be included in my mask. So if I want these characters, I'm going to paint over all the parts of them, and I don't have to be super precise, but I'm going to try to kind of get them all. And it went a little outside there. That's okay. We can fix that. Let's get her legs. Back here. I'm going to try to get his legs as well. There's one. I don't have to do this all in one pass. I'm just kind of doing it. And then I let go, and it's going to take a second, and After Effects is going to look at that and kind of try to draw a mask showing what it thinks that I want to collect. And you can see it's actually done a pretty good job here getting around their heads and around the edge of his arm there. It's gotten all of their legs. It missed this little part of her feet, so I'm going to hold down my command tool, shrink down my brush a little bit, and add in her foot there. And let's add in his foot as well. Okay. And we're missing this bit of her shoulder, so let's add that in. Okay, so now I've kind of gotten most of the stuff I want covered. I haven't gotten his fingers here. I'll get to those in a little bit. But I also grabbed some stuff I don't. Let's say I don't want this space between them to be part of the mask. Maybe they're walking in front of something here that I really don't want to be in my mask. So here's where I'm going to hold down Option. My thing turns red. And so the green tool is things I want to add into my mask. Red is things I want to take out. So I'm going to just sort of get in here and say, I want to take out that whole area. Okay, and that did that pretty well. I still got a little here. I'm going to shrink my painting tool down even more. Hold down Option again and say I really don't want any of that road to show behind him. And you can see I can get in here, Option W to go back to that tool. Hold down Command to really shrink it down. And try to get rid of that part between his feet as well. And now that actually took out that bottom part of his legs. I'm going to add that back in. Let's add in these toes. And add in the rest of his shoe there. Okay, and I can keep going and kind of make this as precise as I'd like, but that's the general idea. Now once I've got this set, make my tool back a little bigger. Now I'm going to go to my Refine Edge tool. So if you look at what we've got with this layer, I'm going to go back in here for a second, layer under it so you can see what I've done. Okay, so here's the mask I've made right now. That's not bad. That's pretty clear around them. I've done a pretty good job edging them out. But you can see these hard edges around them. So if I were to place something else in here, so just for example, you go to a text tool and I'll say text, and text color white, so you can see it better. And let's say I tried to put that text behind this rotoscope layer. And I need to give myself a little more handle to drag here. There we go. Drag that rotoscope layer in front of it. So you can see the text does in fact show up behind them, so now I can have the text between them and the road. And it's not terrible, but those edges are a little hard. Even when I put this background back in, sort of the edges around where them and the text shows up look a little sharp and kind of not exactly natural. So this is where I'm going to go back into my rotoscope. I'm going to use my Refine Edge tool. Count again. So I'm up here, and instead of the Roto Brush tool that I was on, I'm going to go to the Refine Edge tool, and I'm basically going to paint around the edges of things. And I'm going to try to select some space that's in the mask and some that's out. So I don't want to like just paint totally inside the mask or totally outside. I'm really trying to get this border. And let's look at his fingers and hand here. That'll be a good place to look. So let go, and After Effects is going to take a second to calculate. And now what you're seeing is the part that's white is completely in the mask. The part that's black is completely outside the mask, but you can see it's done a little bit of feathering. and made things sort of partially transparent. So you can see around his fingers here, around the edge of his sleeve. And a lot of times that works really well for things that aren't totally sharp or have a little bit of motion blur or something like that to them. That's going to feel a lot more natural. I'm not going to do the whole thing here, but let's just get around this edge of her as well. Okay, now compare that. If I go back to the composition, look how much more natural it looks like they're really sitting there in front of this text, as opposed to before where you could see this very sharp delineation where I had clearly masked them out. This gives me a much better roto effect, really makes that mask work nicely, particularly in motion. Again, we're looking at a freeze frame here, so things are always going to look a little unnatural, but even still, this looks pretty good around the areas I've done it. And if you want to compare that to an area where I haven't, let's say I take this text layer and drag it down here by their legs where I haven't rotoed it. Look how this part of his leg looks here, what a sharp line that is, and doesn't look natural compared to up here around his fingers and sleeves where I did that refined edge. You get a much, much better roto there. So I could do that for the rest of the way around them. Here's the key with this. I said it's partially automated. So once I've gotten that done, I've only really done it for that frame. So now I need to go to the next frame and have it calculate for that. Now if my objects aren't moving super fast and there's not a lot of change, it'll work pretty well, but I'm going to keep an eye on it and kind of babysit it to notice things where, for instance, she has her arm sort of across her side here. She pulls out her arm at some point. I haven't really painted that element or told After Effects to expect there to be something else to mask there, so I'll probably have to go in and add that to the mask at that point. So let's just go forward a frame. And I like to use my shortcuts Command left arrow and Command right arrow to move frame by frame. So I'm just going to do Command right arrow to move forward one frame. And you'll see it has to calculate for a second here and see what's happening with that mask. And now I'm on the next frame and I can see what the roto for that looks like. And if I needed to make any tweaks, I can use my same tools. I can use that refine edge. I can go back to my actual brush tool and add new parts to it, or hold down Option, take away parts if it's added something to the mask that shouldn't be in there. I'll say this still looks pretty good for this part. If I was doing this for real, I'd probably have to go back in and remove this part from between his legs because it's now decided that that should be part of the mask where I didn't want it. I'll go ahead and go to the next frame, and it's going to calculate for a second. Okay, and I look at that and say, all right, that still looks about okay. I'll do one more frame. And you can see where this would be pretty tedious, and this is actually, the auto roto is working pretty well for me in this case. A lot of times I will have to go back in and do more fine-tuning frame by frame. That looked like it held up pretty well. I'm just going to do those 4 frames because this is a very slow process. And then what I want to do when I've got a section rotoed, and this is really important just to make your life better and save yourself some work, is I'm going to hit this freeze button. And what that's going to do is it's going to remember all those rotos it's created for those 4 frames and lock them in and basically make that a permanent mask. So normally, as I'm in this process of doing rotoing, what it is doing is recalculating every time I go to a frame based on whatever strokes I've drawn, whatever areas I've highlighted with the roto brush tool and with the refine edge tool, and it's recalculating those from scratch each time, propagating them forward from before. So in this case, I drew all these lines on that first frame. So if I want to look at this frame again, it has to go back to that first frame, look at the lines, calculate it for that, and then calculate forward how those lines should change each time, including any changes I've made as I went frame by frame babysitting it. That's really slow, and it also means if I go out of here and then change something, I could lose a lot of work. So I want to freeze these and basically have it remember that as a mask. And then if I have to go back in and adjust any of this or do some further frames, I'll have to unfreeze it to do that. But at the moment, since I'm done, I'm going to freeze that. It's going to freeze frame the whole, you can see it's 1 of 21. That's kind of based on the number of strokes that I had done, the number of different times I clicked and changed things. And it also will take longer if I've been through a lot of frames. Okay, and in the interest of time, I'm going to stop that there. But now I've got at least these first few frames done, so I'll go to the composition. And when we hit this point where my roto started, hitting the plus key to zoom in on my timeline so I can see where that layer starts. Okay, so this was the first frame that I did. And again, you can see, remember I didn't do the refine edge around the legs, and those are looking a lot sharper. I did do it around the tops of their body and their arms, and that's looking a lot more natural, really like they're kind of moving in front of it. I can go frame by frame, and here you can see if I turn off these layers and you can kind of see what the actual mask was. Here's where it decided his arm was sort of partially transparent, and that's probably something I would need to go in and fix in my roto because it's making it too transparent. I'm seeing through it too much. And that's something I would have needed to manually fix. Around his shoulder, this is all still looking good. Down here, this is still looking a little too sharp. I'd want to look in here and see what exactly happened there. So this is there's an art to knowing when your roto is good, but that's the process of doing it. And as you see, it's pretty labor intensive, pretty detailed, but you can get a much better mask than just sort of trying to draw a thing with the pen tool or with shapes and trying to draw out a mask that way. And that would be your basics of rotoscoping. So that's what we covered in this tutorial, rotoscoping at the end, and then go back to the beginning. We looked at putting things off in the distance here and grabbing those characters from here and moving them further down the road and making it look like they were really there with some pretty simple effects processing on that little chunk of footage. And that's that.